welcome to my channel. Today, we travel through the haunting echoes of the sky itself, through moments where flight, humanity's proudest achievement, turned into our most terrifying nightmare. This is not one story, but many, stitched together by the sound of alarms, the trembling voices of pilots, and the cries of passengers who never made it home. These are the moments when the skies betrayed their promise, when calm blue turned to fire and steel, and the world below watched in disbelief as history was written in smoke. It begins in the morning calm of Tenerife, 1977, when two Boeing 747s, the largest aircraft in the world at the time, found themselves facing each other on a fog-covered runway. Pan Am Flight 1736 and KLM Flight 4805, both filled with hundreds of lives, waited for clearance to take off. Inside the KLM cockpit, Captain Jacob Van Zanten, one of the airline's most respected pilots, tapped the throttle gently, eager to depart before visibility worsened. The air traffic controller's voice crackled with static. Miscommunication followed, words lost in fog, accents blending, the human voice turned into confusion. "We are now at takeoff," Van Zanten said. But he wasn't cleared. On the same runway, Pan Am's massive 747 was still taxiing toward him. Seconds later, out of the white mist, two giants met in fire and thunder. The collision tore the airfield apart. 583 people were killed in a heartbeat. The world's deadliest aviation accident had begun not in storm or sabotage, but in misunderstanding, ego, and silence. Years later, investigators would replay the cockpit voice recordings over and over. They'd hear calm professionalism turning to panic. "Wait, we're still on the runway!" shouted the Pan Am captain, just moments before the impact. The tapes captured the sound of steel bending, glass shattering, and human voices vanishing mid-sentence. Tenerife became a graveyard for lessons written in blood. Pilots began training to repeat every instruction clearly, word for word. The phrase "Roger" was banned for takeoff clearance forever. But the skies would not stay quiet for long. In 1985, Japan Airlines Flight 123, a Boeing 747, lifted off from Tokyo with 524 souls aboard. It was a warm, ordinary afternoon, families heading home, business travelers reading newspapers, a group of schoolchildren giggling near the windows. 11 minutes into the flight, a sound like a cannon shattered the calm. The rear pressure bulkhead, previously damaged years earlier during maintenance, had failed catastrophically. A deafening explosion ripped through the fuselage, tearing off the plane's tail and destroying its hydraulic systems. Inside the cockpit, Captain Masami Takahama and his crew fought desperately to regain control. But the aircraft no longer obeyed them. It had become a wounded beast, turning and diving through the sky uncontrollably. For 32 unbearable minutes, they fought, using only engine thrust to steer. The passengers could see mountains through the windows, growing larger every second. In the cabin, mothers clutched children, writing final notes on scraps of paper, slipping them into pockets and purses, praying someone would find them. "Please take care of my children," one note said. Another simply read, "I love you, I'm sorry." The plane struck Mount Takamagara at terrifying speed, the explosion lighting the mountainside for miles. Out of 524 people, only 4 survived. When rescuers arrived the next morning, they found the notes still intact, fluttering like leaves across the debris. But not every tragedy came from human error or old metal. Some came from pure cruelty. In 1988, a Pan Am 747 soared high above the Scottish countryside, carrying passengers home for Christmas. Families asleep, children dreaming, lights glowing gently inside the cabin. Then, without warning, the sky opened in fire. A bomb hidden inside a suitcase detonated midair. The aircraft disintegrated, scattering wreckage and lives over the town of Lockerbie. People on the ground watched as flaming pieces of the plane fell into their streets and homes. In one moment, 270 souls were gone, 259 in the plane and 11 on the ground. Investigators later traced the device to Libyan agent. Justice took decades, but the memory of Lockerbie never faded. The sky had once again turned from blue to red. As years passed, the pattern repeated. Different names, different places, the same silence before disaster. Air France Flight 447 vanished over the Atlantic in 2009. What began as a peaceful overnight flight from Rio de Janeiro to Paris ended in a tragic mystery. In the cockpit, the pilots were suddenly surrounded by alarms, ice forming on sensors, the autopilot disengaging. The aircraft began to climb sharply, then stall. Confusion filled the cockpit as warnings overlap. "Pull up," one shouted. "We're falling," cried another. But the instruments betrayed them. In pitch darkness, disoriented, they didn't realize the plane was descending at terrifying speed. The ocean swallowed the Airbus whole. It took 2 years to find the wreckage. The flight data recorder told a heartbreaking story. Experienced pilots overwhelmed by faulty instruments and human panic, doing everything they could, yet losing everything all the same. There were moments, too, when nature itself became the enemy. On June 1, 2009, thunderstorms built like towering walls of black across the sky, lightning streaking through the clouds as pilots navigated blind through turbulence. And decades earlier, in 1991, Lauda Air Flight 004 met its end over the jungles of Thailand. The pilots heard a sudden roar. Their engine's reverse thruster had deployed mid-flight. The aircraft rolled, inverted, and tore itself apart in midair. Investigators found that a single mechanical flaw, a fraction of a second's malfunction, could undo the perfection of man's greatest machine. Each of these tragedies told the same story: the betrayal of trust. The trust between machine and pilot, between control tower and cockpit, between human beings and the sky itself. Yet, through the wreckage and tears, change was born. Every crash reshaped the future. New safety systems were installed, communication protocols rewritten, engines redesigned. Flight data recorders became mandatory, crew resource management became a discipline, and training simulators began teaching pilots not just how to fly, but how to think under pressure. The pain of each disaster became the reason another flight landed safely. And still, the ghosts of those lost flights linger, not in fear, but in legacy. The calm before takeoff, the sound of the seatbelt sign, the voice of the captain, each is a quiet salute to those who never made it home. Every pilot who holds the yoke remembers the names, even if passengers don't. Tenerife, Lockerbie, Japan Airlines, Air France, Lauda Air. All of them live in the way we now fly, in the way every system double-checks itself, in the way we whisper a prayer at 30,000 feet. The sky once betrayed humanity, but humanity learned, adapted, and rose again. The same sky that burned with tragedy now carries millions safely every day, a fragile truce built on memory and metal. The stories of those who perished remind us that safety was never free, it was bought with courage, pain, and lessons carved into the wind. So, when you look up tonight and see a jet crossing the stars, remember, every light in the dark sky carries a story, a legacy, a promise that we will never forget. If you found this story meaningful, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. High above the clouds, where sunlight fades into endless blue, there exists a silence that only pilots know, calm, confident, almost sacred. Yet beneath that silence lies a truth that aviation will never forget. The sky remembers everything. Every scream, every shattering of metal, every final transmission whispered into static, it all lingers. After Tenerife, after Lockerbie, after Japan Airlines 123, the world thought it had seen enough tragedy to last a century, but the skies were not done writing their lessons in fire and tears. It was August 12, 1985. Japan Airlines Flight 123, a Boeing 747 bound for Osaka, rolled down Tokyo's Haneda runway with the confidence of routine. The flight was packed with families returning home after a long weekend, businessmen flipping through newspapers, flight attendants smiling as they greeted passengers. In the cockpit sat Captain Masami Takahama, a man who had logged thousands of hours and earned the trust of everyone who flew with him. The takeoff was smooth, the climb steady, and the view from 30,000 feet breathtaking. But 11 minutes after departure, the flight's calm rhythm shattered. A deafening boom tore through the cabin, followed by a violent jolt that sent drinks and belongings flying. Passengers screamed as oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. The tail of the aircraft had torn apart, its hydraulic lines severed. In an instant, the 747, one of the most sophisticated aircraft ever built, had lost the ability to steer. Inside the cockpit, chaos erupted. Red lights flashed across the panels, alarms blared, and the stick felt dead in the captain's hands. "Hydraulics failure," shouted the flight engineer. "No control." Captain Takahama pulled, pushed, and adjusted every lever he could, but the plane refused to respond. It climbed and dove like a bird caught in a storm, the passengers feeling weightless 1 second, crushed by gravity the next. Down below, air traffic controllers stared at their radar screens in disbelief as the 747 began flying wide, uncommanded circles over the Japanese mountains. They called out again and again, their voices shaking, "Japan 123, please descend, do you read?" But the only reply came in broken fragments. "Uncontrollable. Mayday, mayday." Unable to maintain altitude. In the cabin, fear had turned into quiet acceptance. Parents held their children close, whispering prayers. Some passengers wrote messages on napkins and scraps of paper, final words for loved ones they would never see again. "To my family, thank you for everything. Please take care of the children," read one note found later in the wreckage. Flight attendants moved bravely through the chaos, helping passengers with masks, comforting those who were sobbing uncontrollably. They knew the truth. The plane was dying and nothing could stop it. For half an hour, the massive jet wandered through the sky like a wounded bird, its engines roaring helplessly. On the ground, fighter jets scrambled to intercept, hoping to guide the 747 toward safety. But before they could reach it, Flight 123 banked steeply to the right and slammed into the side of Mount Takamagara. The explosion lit up the mountainside like sunrise. 524 people had been aboard. Only 4 survived. The investigation revealed something that made the world's blood run cold. Years earlier, the plane had suffered a tail strike during a rough landing. The rear pressure bulkhead had been repaired, but not properly. A single line of rivets had failed, and over the years, every takeoff and landing had weakened the structure, until that day, when the pressure difference at altitude tore it apart. A mistake made 7 years earlier had waited patiently to kill. The lessons from Japan Airlines 123 changed aviation forever, forcing airlines to adopt stricter maintenance standards and mandatory inspections for any aircraft involved in structural damage. But still, the skies held more sorrow to give. Just 3 years later, on December 21, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 took off from London's Heathrow Airport, bound for New York. It was almost Christmas. Families, students, and business travelers filled the seats, their minds already home with the holidays ahead. The Boeing 747 lifted into the night sky, its lights glittering like a star. Everything seemed normal, smooth climb, steady altitude, clear weather. Then, at 7:03 p.m., an explosion ripped through the forward cargo hold. The entire nose section of the aircraft tore away. Within seconds, the plane broke apart midair over the small Scottish town of Lockerbie. Residents looked up to see fire raining from the heavens, pieces of fuselage and luggage scattering across their fields, engines crashing into houses. The ground shook as if the earth itself had screamed. 259 people on the plane died instantly, along with 11 people on the ground. Investigators would later discover a suitcase bomb, hidden within the luggage hold, a device built with a timer and explosive charge so small it fit inside a portable cassette player. It had been placed on the plane by Libyan intelligence agents. The motive was political retaliation, the cost was human tragedy. Lockerbie became not just a place, but a scar on humanity's conscience. The horror of that night echoed through the decades. Forensic teams spent months combing through wreckage spread across 845 square miles. They found teddy bears, letters, burned passports, and fragments of the bomb itself. One piece of circuit board, smaller than a fingernail, led them to the truth. But for the families, no answer could replace what was taken. From that moment on, airport security changed forever. Luggage was no longer just weighed, it was questioned, scanned, traced, and tracked. Every unaccompanied bag became a threat. Every security agent a silent guardian. The skies demanded vigilance, and humanity obeyed. Then, in 2009, another tragedy reminded the world how fragile flight could be, even in the age of modern technology. Air France Flight 447, an Airbus A330, departed Rio de Janeiro en route to Paris. It was a routine red-eye over the Atlantic, the kind of flight most passengers sleep through. But that night the skies were angry. Thunderheads towered high, storms dancing across the equator. The pilots, experienced men, trusted their instruments, but as they entered the turbulence, the airspeed sensors froze. The cockpit filled with conflicting data. The autopilot disengaged. Suddenly, nothing made sense. The plane climbed steeply, then stalled, dropping thousands of feet per minute. The crew tried to recover, but confusion ruled. The horizon vanished, and they no longer knew which way was up. Their training failed them, not from lack of skill, but from fear, from chaos, from the storm outside and within. The Airbus slammed into the ocean, killing all 228 aboard. When investigators recovered the black boxes 2 years later, they listened to the final minutes. Pilots shouting commands, instruments giving false readings, alarms blaring, and then the sound of calm acceptance before impact. The ocean swallowed their words, but their struggle changed everything. New procedures were developed, training improved, and technology advanced to prevent such tragedies from repeating. Each of these stories, Japan Airlines, Lockerbie, Air France, shows a different kind of betrayal. Sometimes it was steel that failed, sometimes it was men, and sometimes it was the sky itself. Yet every time, humanity refused to turn away. Each disaster became a lesson, each loss a blueprint for survival. The passengers may be gone, but the world still flies safely because of them. Even today, when you sit on a plane and hear the captain's voice, when you feel the hum of the engines beneath your feet, you're living inside the legacy of those who never made it home. Their stories are not just tragedies, they're the foundation of safety, courage, and remembrance that keeps humanity in the air. Because the day the skies betrayed humanity, humanity vowed it would never let the skies win again. The story of aviation's darkest days continued to unfold in the years that followed, each disaster reminding the world that progress often comes written in pain, each new aircraft more advanced, yet still vulnerable to the same frailties. Human error, nature's fury, or one small, invisible flaw waiting quietly beneath the surface. The skies had become both a triumph and a test of humanity's will, and though technology promised safety, fate often had other plans. It was November 12, 1996, when the serenity of the skies above India shattered into chaos. Saudi Arabian Airlines Flight 763, a Boeing 747, had just taken off from New Delhi, climbing slowly through the twilight, its lights glowing softly against the darkening sky. At the same time, Kazakhstan Airlines Flight 1907, a smaller Aviation IL-76 cargo plane, was descending toward the same airport. Both planes were on the same air corridor, a busy route that stretched over the Indian countryside. On radar screens, two blips began to move closer and closer still. In the control tower, air traffic controllers tried to separate them, their voices rising in urgency, but English was not the native language of either flight crew, and miscommunication once again began to poison the air. "Maintain flight level 150, the controller said to the Kazakhstan crew, meaning 15,000 feet. But the pilots misunderstood, descending instead to 14,000 feet. In those final seconds, both aircraft were hurtling toward each other at over 800 miles per hour. In the Saudi jet's cockpit, the crew saw a flash of light, a shape appearing out of nowhere through the haze. The co-pilot shouted, "Traffic! Traffic!" but there was no time. The nose of the Kazakh plane sliced clean through the belly of the 747. The sky erupted into fire. Both planes disintegrated instantly, scattering wreckage across the quiet fields of Charki Dadri, a rural farming village that had never seen an airplane up close until that night. Witnesses on the ground saw balls of flame raining down, the roar so loud it made windows shatter miles away. The ground shook as metal and human remains fell like a storm. When rescuers arrived, they found only fire, twisted wreckage, and silence. All 349 people aboard both aircraft had been killed. Mothers, children, entire families erased in the blink of an eye. It was the world's deadliest mid-air collision. Investigators soon found the cause: a breakdown in communication, poor adherence to flight levels, and a reliance on voice commands instead of radar technology. It was a tragedy born not of mechanical failure, but of human misunderstanding. The result was devastating, but it forced a revolution in the skies. Nations rushed to install collision avoidance systems known as TCAS, technology that would allow planes to detect each other and automatically instruct pilots to climb or descend to avoid impact. Out of the fire over India came a new era of safety, proof again that every disaster leaves behind a lesson written in sorrow. Yet just 3 years later, tragedy returned in a form no one could have predicted. On October 31, 1999, Egyptair Flight 990 departed New York's JFK Airport for Cairo. The night was calm, the weather clear, the passengers settling in for the long journey across the Atlantic. Somewhere over the ocean, however, something went terribly wrong. The flight data recorder would later show a chilling sequence of events. The captain had stepped out of the cockpit for a brief break, leaving the relief first officer in command. Within minutes, the plane began to descend rapidly. Alarms blared. The captain rushed back in, shouting, "What's happening? What are you doing?" The co-pilot's only words were, "I rely on God." In seconds, the Boeing 767 plunged from 33,000 feet, diving at incredible speed. The captain fought desperately to pull the plane out of the descent, throttling the engines forward, but the co-pilot pushed the controls the opposite way. The two men struggled physically in the cockpit, one trying to save the plane, the other seemingly determined to bring it down. Moments later, the aircraft broke apart and vanished into the Atlantic. All 217 people on board were killed. When investigators recovered the black boxes, they were confronted with one of the most disturbing transcripts in aviation history. The cause was not mechanical, it was deliberate. The co-pilot, later identified as suffering from severe emotional and professional distress, had intentionally crashed the plane in an apparent act of suicide. The idea that someone could turn an airliner into a weapon of personal despair horrified the world. Airlines began to re-evaluate psychological screening, cockpit access procedures, and monitoring of flight crew behavior. It was a new kind of threat, one that no radar or technology could prevent. But the sky's vengeance was not finished. Just 2 years later, on September 11, 2001, the unimaginable happened. 4 commercial airliners were hijacked by terrorists and used as weapons against their own passengers and against the heart of nations. The world watched in real time as the planes struck the Twin Towers of New York, turned the Pentagon to fire, and fell into the fields of Pennsylvania. The sight of a plane, once a symbol of connection, freedom, and progress, became, for the first time, a symbol of terror. Thousands died not because of mechanical failure or weather, but because of hatred. Aviation changed forever that day. Cockpit doors were reinforced, air marshals deployed, and global security tightened to levels once thought unthinkable. The age of innocence in air travel ended. But not all tragedies came from malice. In 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 vanished without a trace, a modern mystery that continues to haunt the world. It took off from Kuala Lumpur, bound for Beijing, its passengers dozing as the lights dimmed and the engines roared softly into the night. Then, somewhere over the South China Sea, its transponder went dark. Radar contact disappeared. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. No distress call, no debris, no goodbye. Weeks turned into months, and the world searched the oceans endlessly, desperate for answers. Theories filled the silence. Mechanical failure, hijacking, deliberate sabotage, even military error. None could be proven. The wreckage was never fully found, and the black boxes remain lost in the deep. It became the greatest mystery in aviation history, a ghost flight swallowed by the sea. And as if one loss were not enough, months later, another Malaysia Airlines jet, Flight 17, was shot down over eastern Ukraine by a surface-to-air missile. 298 lives, gone in seconds, scattered across burning fields of war. The tragedy was no accident. It was man's cruelty once again reaching into the heavens, proving that the sky, though vast, is not beyond our violence. Each of these disasters told a different story, one of mechanical fragility, human pride, mental anguish, political hatred, or pure chance, but all shared a single truth. No matter how far we advanced, we were still vulnerable to the smallest crack, the shortest lapse, the briefest silence on a radio channel. Every new aircraft that lifted off carried not just passengers, but ghosts, the spirits of Tenerife, Lockerbie, Japan, Egypt, and Malaysia, watching, warning, reminding. Yet, through the grief, humanity refused to give up on the sky. Every crash brought innovation, every mistake sparked reform. Technology evolved, yes, but so did compassion. Out of the pain came purpose. Pilots trained harder, engineers designed smarter, air traffic systems became global networks of safety and precision. Airplanes became not symbols of fear, but of endurance. The sky might betray us, but we learned to fight back, with knowledge, with resilience, with hope. Because in the end, flight is more than just physics, it is faith. Faith in metal, in machines, in each other. Every time a jet leaves the runway, it carries within it the memory of those who fell before, and the promise that their deaths were not in vain. Humanity has been burned by the skies again and again, but every time we rise from the ashes, rebuilding, learning, flying still. And though the clouds may hide our fears, they can never erase our courage. The years that followed carried with them both silence and echoes, the silence of planes that never called for help, and the echoes of voices still trapped in black boxes buried beneath oceans and mountains. The history of aviation had always been written in courage and progress, but beneath that gleaming surface lay a darker script, one carved into the memory of those who survived, those who searched, and those who simply waited for answers that never came. The sky had turned into both sanctuary and battlefield, and for every miracle flight that landed safely, there existed another that never saw the runway again. It was 2000, the dawn of a new century, and people believed that technology had finally tamed the sky. Computers now flew planes more precisely than human hands could, autopilot systems were infallible, and flight data streamed across the world in real time. Yet, the skies still demanded humility. On August 23, 2000, Gulf Air Flight 072 took off from Cairo, bound for Bahrain. It was a short, uneventful flight, calm skies, no storms, no warnings. As the Airbus A320 approached Bahrain International Airport for landing, the lights of the runway glowed clearly ahead. But something went wrong in those final moments, something simple, something human. The plane came in too high and too fast. The captain attempted to correct it by executing a sharp turn for another landing attempt, but in the confusion, he disengaged the autopilot and pulled back on the stick at the wrong moment. The plane entered a stall and plunged nose first into the shallow waters just off the coast. Within seconds, it disintegrated. All 143 people on board were killed. their final approach becoming a lesson that even the smallest lapse in judgment could erase perfection in an instant. The investigators found no fault in the machine, only in the man. The captain had ignored the stall warnings, trusting his instincts instead of his instrument. It was a reminder that as technology advanced, humans could still be their own worst enemy in the cockpit. Airlines around the world began implementing crew resource management training, a new philosophy that taught pilots to question, to double-check, to communicate clearly, and to respect the automation they once distrusted. But even as those lessons spread, the skies prepared another test. Just 1 year later, on a clear night in July 2002, a freight dispatcher in a small control tower in southern Germany found himself overseeing too many flights at once. Over the tranquil airspace above Lake Constance, 2 massive jets were on a collision course. Bashkirian Airlines Flight 2937, a Tupolev Tu-154 carrying Russian schoolchildren on a holiday trip, and a DHL cargo Boeing 757 bound for Brussels. Their flight paths were supposed to intersect safely, one above the other. But a single error, a missed signal, and a system glitch set disaster in motion. In the Bashkirian cockpit, the crew received an automated warning from their new collision avoidance system: climb. At the same moment, the DHL pilots received the opposite instruction: descend. But the overworked air traffic controller, unaware of the conflicting messages, told the Russian pilots to descend instead. Torn between trusting a human voice or a machine, they obeyed the controller. 30 seconds later, the 2 aircraft collided midair at 35,000 feet. The explosion lit up the night sky like a second sunrise. 71 people were killed, most of them children. Wreckage rained down over the quiet German countryside, scattering toys, notebooks, and letters among the trees. The tragedy shook Europe to its core. The investigation revealed that the technology had been right, but humans had overridden it. From that night onward, every pilot was taught one unbreakable rule: trust the system. No matter what a controller says, if the warning says climb, you climb. That rule would save countless lives in the years that followed, born from the ashes of one man's voice on a night when 2 planes passed each other in hell. Yet even as the skies grew safer, the human heart remained unpredictable. In 2015, Germanwings Flight 9525 departed Barcelona for Düsseldorf. It was a routine European flight, short, calm, and uneventful. In the cockpit sat a young co-pilot named Andreas Lubitz, quiet, polite, and seemingly normal. Midway through the flight, the captain left the cockpit to use the restroom. When he tried to return, the door was locked. "Open the door," he said calmly over the intercom. No response. "Andreas, open the door." Still silence. Then, without warning, the Airbus A320 began to descend. Air traffic control tried to contact the plane, no reply. Passengers sat in confusion as the mountain range below grew larger through the windows. The captain pounded on the door, shouting, begging, breaking his hands against the metal. Inside, the co-pilot sat still, breathing steadily, staring forward. The black box later revealed his final words: "Now we go down." 8 minutes later, Germanwings 9525 struck the French Alps at over 400 miles per hour. There were no survivors. The motive was simple and horrifying. The co-pilot had suffered from severe depression, and in his final act of despair, took 149 innocent lives with him. The tragedy forced a worldwide reckoning on pilot mental health, cockpit access, and psychological evaluation. Airlines introduced the 2-person rule in the cockpit, ensuring that no pilot would ever again be left alone in command. But for the families of those on board, no new rule could erase the screams echoing through those mountains. And still, the skies tested humanity further. 2 years later, in 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 lifted off from Jakarta. It was a brand new Boeing 737 MAX, fresh from the factory, its passengers unaware that a deadly flaw hid within its code. Minutes after takeoff, the pilots fought against the aircraft's automated system. The MCOS, designed to push the nose down to prevent stalling. But the system had malfunctioned. Each time the pilots pulled the plane up, the computer forced it down again. Warnings blared, alarms screamed, and the stick shuddered in their hands. "It's not responding," the captain shouted. "Pull up! Pull up!" But the system ignored them. 11 minutes later, the plane plunged into the Java Sea. 5 months later, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crashed in the same way. Same model, same malfunction, same outcome. The Boeing 737 MAX was grounded worldwide, and for the first time in modern history, the world's trust in aviation's biggest manufacturer was shaken. Investigators revealed that Boeing had hidden the flaw to avoid delays in production. Greed, not weather or error, had brought down the planes. Each investigation, each heartbreak, added to the long, painful evolution of flight. The skies were becoming safer, but never kind. Every mistake was a ghost, every lesson written in fire. Yet through every tragedy, humanity refused to surrender. The pilots who took off the next morning did so knowing the risks, the engineers rebuilt, the families mourned but stood before cameras demanding change. Out of every burning fuselage rose something unbreakable: resolve. Because the story of flight is not just about machines, it's about people. It's about a mother holding her child during turbulence, a pilot gripping the controls while alarms scream, an air traffic controller whispering prayers into static, a rescuer walking through wreckage at dawn. It's about courage in the face of chaos, about love in the final seconds before silence. Every crash reminds us that flight is not just science, it's faith. Faith that when humanity climbs into the sky, it will find a way to come home again. And though the skies have betrayed humanity again and again, humanity has answered with defiance. Every time an engine starts, every time a wheel leaves the ground, every time someone looks out the window and whispers, "We made it," the ghosts of the past fly with them, watching, guiding, reminding the world that safety is not given. It is earned, one tragedy, one tear, one hard-won lesson at a time. By the time the second decade of the 21st century arrived, the world believed it had finally conquered the dangers of the sky. Airplanes had become flying computers, built with precision and tested beyond imagination. Every sensor, every circuit, every signal seemed foolproof. People boarded flights without fear, scrolling through phones, sipping coffee, trusting that the sky had become predictable. But the sky, as history proved, never forgets how to humble those who take it for granted. Every comfort at 35,000 feet is borrowed from the lessons paid for in tragedy, and every once in a while, it reminds us that human perfection is still fragile, still fallible, still capable of breaking in the cold, thin air above the cloud. It was March 8, 2014, when Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 took off from Kuala Lumpur bound for Beijing, a midnight flight filled with families, business travelers, and crew expecting another routine journey. The weather was calm, and Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah was experienced, composed, and respected by his colleagues. At 1:19 a.m., as the aircraft crossed into Vietnamese airspace, the co-pilot's voice came over the radio. "Good night, Malaysian 370. It was polite, ordinary, the kind of farewell exchanged thousands of times a day. Then, without explanation, the plane vanished from radar. No distress call. No mayday. 1 second it was there, an invisible green dot on a controller's screen, and the next gone. Confusion erupted in control rooms across Southeast Asia. Vietnam called Malaysia, Malaysia called Singapore, then Thailand, then India. No one could find the plane. For hours, officials assumed it had suffered a communication failure or diverted to another airport. But by dawn, hope began to fade. The Boeing 777 was gone, completely gone. It had simply disappeared into the endless blue. Search teams scoured the South China Sea, but the ocean offered no clues. Not a single floating seat, no debris, not even an oil slick. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The families gathered in hotels and airports, watching news screens that offered nothing but theories. As investigators expanded their search, a chilling pattern emerged. Military radar data showed that after the transponder shut off, the plane had turned sharply west, crossing back over the Malay Peninsula and heading into the Indian Ocean. Someone had flown it deliberately off course. The flight continued for 6 hours after it lost contact, silent, unseen, and uncontrolled. The possibilities tore through the world like a fever. Hijacking, mechanical failure, pilot suicide, even espionage. Satellite data indicated a final descent somewhere in the vast southern Indian Ocean, a region so remote it's called the middle of nowhere. For years, ships and aircraft scoured millions of square miles of ocean. They found a few fragments of wreckage washed ashore on distant beaches, but the fuselage, the engines, the black boxes, everything else remains lost to this day. Flight 370 became the greatest mystery in modern aviation. Without wreckage, there could be no closure. Without closure, there could be no peace. The families still wait, still hold photographs, still stare at the sky wondering if somewhere beneath the waves lies the answer they've begged for since that night. The incident transformed global tracking systems. Airlines adopted new satellite communication methods, ensuring that no flight could ever simply disappear again. But the questions, the uncertainty, the ache, they still linger like contrails fading in the dark. The following year, as if one heartbreak weren't enough, Malaysia Airlines suffered another unimaginable blow. On July 17, 2014, Flight 17, a Boeing 777 flying from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur, soared peacefully above the clouds. Passengers settled into movies and meals, unaware that far below, over the war-torn skies of eastern Ukraine, a missile system had just locked onto them. In a flash of light, the surface-to-air missile struck the plane at 33,000 feet. The aircraft broke apart instantly, raining wreckage across miles of farmland and villages. All 298 people on board were killed. The world watched in horror as images of the debris spread across the news. Burning fuselage, suitcases torn open, children's toys lying in the dirt. The investigation revealed that the missile had been fired from a rebel-controlled area using a Russian-made Buk launcher. The target was never meant to be a passenger plane, but war has never cared for innocence. Flight 17 became a global symbol of how political violence had infected even the skies. International outrage followed, sanctions were imposed, and families once again faced the unbearable reality that their loved ones had become casualties in a conflict they had nothing to do with. Aviation experts called it the day the sky was no longer neutral. It was no longer just about weather or metal or error. It was about humanity's endless capacity for destruction. The aviation world responded with heartbreak and reform. Routes over war zones were re-evaluated, flight corridors shifted, and international regulations tightened. No one wanted to believe that a simple commercial flight could be turned into a casualty of politics, yet that was the truth. The sky, once humanity's shared frontier, had become another battlefield. But through all the sorrow, through all the ashes, there was one constant truth. Every tragedy, no matter how unbearable, forced the world to look inward, to ask not just how it happened, but why it was allowed to happen. And then came 2018, when the sky once again betrayed humanity not with malice, but with arrogance. Boeing, one of the most trusted names in aviation, had released its newest jet, the 737 MAX. A machine promised to be safer, smarter, and more efficient than ever before. But hidden inside its systems was a silent flaw, a software design meant to correct a stall that didn't exist. Lion Air Flight 610 took off from Jakarta with 189 souls on board. Moments later, sensors sent false data, and the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, the MCAS, activated. It forced the nose down. The pilots fought back, pulling the controls up again and again, but the system kept pushing. The alarms screamed, the stick shook violently, and the captain's breathing grew ragged as they tried everything to save the plane. 11 minutes later, the jet plunged into the Java Sea, leaving a trail of oil and debris floating on the surface. The world mourned, but Boeing reassured everyone that the problem was understood, that the fix was simple. Yet just 5 months later, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 met the same fate. Same malfunction. Same design flaw. 157 more people gone. When the truth finally came out, it was damning. Boeing had known about the issue, had failed to train pilots properly, had prioritized profits and deadlines over safety. The revelation broke the industry's heart. The 737 MAX fleet was grounded worldwide, and for the first time in decades, faith in flight itself seemed shaken. It wasn't nature this time, or error or war, it was greed. Humanity's oldest flaw had reached 35,000 feet. In the aftermath, hearings were held, executives questioned, reforms passed. Families spoke tearfully before the world, holding photographs and telling stories of laughter, of birthdays, of dreams cut short. The sky listened in silence, as it always had, carrying both the weight of their grief and the hope that it might never happen again. Out of their loss came a renewed commitment to safety, transparency, and truth. Through all these tragedies, Flight 370's mystery, Flight 17's violence, Flight 610's failure, the same message echoed again and again. The sky does not forgive carelessness. It rewards humility and punishes arrogance. Each investigation peeled back not just the science of flight, but the soul of humanity itself, showing our brilliance and our blindness side by side. And still we flew. Because flight, for all its pain, is also a miracle, the defiance of gravity, the proof of progress, the bridge between hearts across the world. Every time a jet engine roars to life, every time passengers settle into their seats, there's an invisible chorus of those who came before, whispering reminders in the whine of the turbines. Stay vigilant, stay humble, remember us. For the sky is beautiful, but it is also merciless. It demands respect, and every tragedy carved that truth deeper into the heart of mankind. And as night falls over runways and the stars reflect in the windows of planes climbing into darkness, the legacy of those lost flights lives on, not just in regulations or memorials, but in the courage of the living who still dare to trust the air. The sky may have betrayed humanity time and again, but humanity still answers, still rises, still believes that the same sky that took so much can also carry us home. The story of the skies is a story of faith, faith tested, broken, and rebuilt through the tears of those who never stopped looking upward. By the time the world entered the 2020s, aviation had evolved into one of the safest forms of travel ever created. Billions of people flew every year, and for every safe landing, humanity silently thanked the ghosts of the past, the voices recorded in black boxes, the families who demanded truth, and the engineers who refused to stop learning from tragedy. But the sky has its own memory, and even as technology reached perfection, the smallest misstep still had the power to bring nations to their knees. In early 2020, before the world would even begin to understand the meaning of isolation, a Ukrainian International Airlines Flight 752 departed Tehran in the pre-dawn darkness. Passengers whispered sleepy goodbyes into phones, buckled in, and closed their eyes as the engines thundered to life. It was supposed to be a simple 2-hour flight to Kiev. The air was calm, the sky clear, the pilots confident. But only minutes after takeoff, as the plane climbed over the outskirts of the city, a trail of light streaked across the sky. It wasn't lightning. It wasn't fire. It was a missile. The explosion lit the night as bright as dawn. The Boeing 737 broke apart in midair, burning fragments falling over icy field. All 176 souls on board were gone before the wreckage even touched the ground. 4 days, confusion reigned, rumors of mechanical failure, of engine fire, of sabotage. But soon, the truth emerged. The aircraft had been mistakenly shot down by a surface-to-air missile, fired in panic amid rising military tensions. A mistake so tragic, so cruel in its simplicity, that even the officials who had pulled the trigger wept when they saw the remains. Families from Iran, Canada, Ukraine, Sweden, and Afghanistan gathered at airports holding photographs, their cries piercing the walls of terminals. The world was reminded once again that the sky, for all its beauty, could still be weaponized by fear. And yet, for all the pain and anger, for all the headlines and investigations, something extraordinary happened in the aftermath: unity. The tragedy crossed borders, religions, and politics. Nations demanded justice not as enemies but as one voice, a global chorus saying enough, enough death, enough error, enough arrogance. Out of the fire, something deeply human rose again: compassion. In that same year, as the world fell silent under the weight of a global pandemic, airplanes rested in rows on deserted runways, their engines covered, their windows reflecting empty skies. For the first time in modern history, humanity's wings were folded. The air grew still. And yet, when flight finally resumed, people boarded planes again not with fear, but with gratitude. Every takeoff became a symbol of survival, every landing proof that progress endures even after darkness. But the lessons of the past continued to echo, because the skies never stop testing mankind. In 2021, Sriwijaya Air Flight 182 took off from Jakarta during a stormy afternoon. It was supposed to be a short, easy domestic hop. Within 4 minutes of takeoff, the aircraft vanished from radar. The black boxes would later reveal that the plane's throttle system had malfunctioned, forcing one engine to produce more thrust than the other. The aircraft rolled sharply and plunged into the Java Sea. 62 people were lost. Another reminder, as cruel as it was simple: even the smallest technical fault can turn confidence into chaos in seconds. And in 2023, the world was shaken again when a Yeti Airlines ATR-72 crashed during its final approach in Nepal. Passengers on board had been filming the breathtaking mountain scenery, recording their final moments as laughter turned to horror. Seconds before landing, the plane banked sharply and nosedived into a gorge, bursting into flames. The video spread across the internet, forcing the world to confront tragedy in real time. The cause, an error during configuration and power loss, was mechanical, yes, but also human. Once again, the ancient dance between man and machine ended in heartbreak. But what makes aviation different from any other field is how it transforms pain into prevention. After each disaster, investigators don't turn away, they dive into the wreckage, study every wire, listen to every final word, and force themselves to feel every consequence. Because every answer they find saves someone else tomorrow. The flight data, the patterns, the procedures, they become the invisible armor around every future passenger. That is why aviation remains both the most haunting and the most hopeful story mankind has ever written. Every black box ever recovered carries not just data, but dignity. Inside those recordings are human voices, pilots trying to save lives, crew members calming passengers, loved ones holding each other in the last seconds of life. Each word, each heartbeat is turned into wisdom. The voices of tragedy become the teachers of tomorrow. The families left behind are the true heroes of these stories. From Tenerife to Lockerbie, from Japan to Ukraine, they are the ones who stood before governments and demanded change when the world wanted to forget. They turned mourning into movement. It was mothers and fathers who forced airlines to fix maintenance standards, who made governments agree on global safety rules, who built memorials so the world would remember that safety isn't statistics, it's sacrifice. Their pain built the systems that keep billions alive today. And now, whenever a flight cuts across the night sky, its lights blinking through the dark, it carries not just passengers but the memory of everyone who ever trusted the sky and never returned. Every safety checklist, every pilot's briefing, every smooth landing is their legacy. The sky has betrayed humanity more than once, but humanity never stopped believing. Each tragedy left scars, yes, but it also left strength. When you sit by an airplane window and watch the clouds drift beneath you, you are flying through the echoes of their stories. You are gliding on the lessons they taught, carried by the courage of those who faced the unthinkable so you wouldn't have to. The engines hum not just with power, but with remembrance. The seatbelt sign clicks not as routine, but as respect. The calm voice of the captain, steady through turbulence, is more than reassurance, it's a promise kept. The sky no longer belongs to tragedy, it belongs to resilience. Every safe arrival is a victory over history itself. Humanity didn't conquer the heavens through pride, it did so through remembrance. The names of the flights: Pan Am 103, Japan 123, Air France 447, Malaysia 370, MH17, Germanwings 9525. They are not forgotten. They live on in every rule rewritten, every storm avoided, every saved life. So, when night falls and you hear the distant roar of a jet engine overhead, remember what it carries. Not just people or luggage, but stories, millions of them, proof that even after betrayal, after loss, after all the sorrow carved into the wind, humanity still rises. We still fly. If this story moved you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Together, we'll keep honoring the courage, the sacrifice, and the human spirit that continues to reach for the skies, no matter how many times the skies have broken our hearts. Because as long as we remember, as long as we learn, the sky will never truly betray us again.